Welcome, everyone. Today is August 28th, 2019. I'm Dr. Terry Hildebrandt, the Director of Evidence-Based Coaching at Fielding Graduate University. Welcome to our esteemed panel, as well as our visitors and audience. This is the Evidence-Based Coaching Professional Series Webinar, and today we're very excited to have a distinguished panel of spiritual leaders, and our topic is coaching in pastoral work and faith communities for spiritual development. Today we'll be hearing from scholar practitioners who have incorporated coaching into their work in pastoral care and spiritual guidance. We'll be exploring how coaching principles and approaches can effectively enhance spiritual development, and the panelists will discuss their work as in both individuals and groups and learn why coaching is becoming an essential skill for clergy, pastors, and spiritual directors. Today we have Dr. Susan Bejan. We also have Jean-Marie Mudd and Adam Robersmith, Dr. Adam Robersmith, and they'll be discussing their experiences of using coaching in pastoral care and spiritual guidance. So just to kick things off, the first question for the panel is, tell us about your journey of incorporating coaching into your work as a spiritual leader. And let's start with Jamie, which is also her second name. So Jamie, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about your work.
Thank you. Yes, I am delighted to introduce myself as pastor of congregational ministries here at Greensboro First Friends in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I'm actually new in my role as pastor of congregational ministry, and having had a lengthy career in consulting and coaching in public education, public health, and social change work. The journey of becoming involved with ministry actually is a decade long, where I began by offering retreats and opportunities for renewal for clergy and congregational renewal. And as I came through the Fielding graduate program for evidence-based coaching, I saw the natural intersection between all of this and people's spiritual evolution in their journey. So for me, moving into my role as pastor of a congregation, it's been a natural fit to bring all those skills right into the spiritual nurture side of what this congregation has asked for individuals, and of course, coaching groups and the actual journey of the entire body of this Quaker meeting as it charts a course in 21st century Quaker faith and Christianity.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. So let's hear from Dr. Robersmith.
Yeah, I'm the Reverend Dr. Adam Robersmith. Still strange to introduce myself that way some days. I am the senior minister at the Unitarian Universalist congregation called the Universalist Church of West Hartford. It's a historically Universalist congregation. We'll be celebrating our bicentennial in 2021. So it's an exciting congregation to serve. In addition to doing that work, I am also a spiritual director and formation specialist. And so my doctoral work was in spiritual formation in liberal religious communities, and particularly working with seminarians and ministers-to-be. And so now I do some volunteering and consulting work with the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association in creating programs for formation, both for seminarians, but also for people in longer-term pastorates. And so for me, I actually have not been through the Fielding program. I'm not an accredited coach, but a lot of the techniques of coaching and a lot of the ideas of coaching and formation work in spiritual leadership are really very similar. And in fact, a big part of what I do is basically encouraging people to find their ways into discovering the possibilities of learning, and coaching is one of the things that I often recommend that people take up. And our UUMA, our Ministers Association, has a coaching program within it. So we have a lot of ways in which we say, we can take care of your spiritual side, we can take care of your skills side, and there is a big, big overlap between these, and a necessary So for me, I'm actually always excited. I spend time with coaches at least once a year at a conference. And what I learn from that world is something that I then incorporate back into what I do and encourage in my own denomination.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Bijan.
Yeah. So I get you, Adam. I'm Reverend Dr. Suzanne Bijan, and my journey has been so exciting and so blessed. It's been diverse and it continues to unfold. Next week marks my 40th anniversary of my very first sermon. I started out, I just knew I was going to go forth in the Lutheran faith and be a lay minister, and plans changed. I found quickly that life coaching is something I was drawn to. So I did a lot of life coaching, and then thought, occupational therapy. And during my formal education, I was introduced to pastoral ministry. And there was a program here in Minnesota at St. Catherine's. And, you know, when you talk about those experiences where the heavens open and you just know that's you, that happened. But my work has been in community. So I've been blessed to work in homeless ministries, in an inner city program that President Carter had called the Atlanta Project, and really in the non-traditional, church pastorate role. Recently, I did spend some time at a Christian mysticism church where I served as the lead pastor. And currently, I serve as the leader of a spiritual retreat center. During this time, I've kept my my coaching business kind of at the forefront because that's who I am. And in my spiritual retreat center, definitely both groups and individuals. I also serve as a master teacher in the Rising Mystic class. So as a non-denominational ordained minister, I just believe that I've had the best life and continue to watch it unfold. And for me, coaching is a spiritual process.
Great. Well, thank you all for the powerful introductions, sharing about your journeys. Our next question is going to be focused a little more on how you have seen coaching support spiritual development of individuals. And let's start with Jamie again.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a wonderful question. One of the things I want to share to the audience that's present tonight or whoever's watching the recording is that we know through the shift of the ICF accreditation process that increasingly the coaching profession is acknowledging and embracing the inner work of individuals as a critical part of the coaching journey. Who people are, connecting who they are with what they do, allowing people to experience their embodied self and their soul's own cry for congruence in who they are and what they do. And so that's the very heart of coaching, is nurturing the self that wants to bring their gifts and leadings into the world. In this space of denominational life or non-denominational faith life, the more explicit role of a spiritual nurturer or spiritual director or pastor is to actually nurture the inner world of each individual, their gifts and their assets, very much like the good coaching journey actually asks for, in a way that honors the self that is seeking congruence with their lives and an expression of their gifts and abilities, as well as a powerful shift into what they know they need to do if they have to learn something new or try something new or take risks. And all of that energy actually comes from the spiritual journey from within, that's really where all the energy to manifest these changes is coming from. To be able to be explicit about it in my role is an absolute joy. When I've done corporate consulting, or when I've even done community development or public spaces coaching, it's been a little bit more of a challenge to explicitly say this is a spiritual journey. And that's the most important part of whatever it is your direct report has asked of you, because nothing else will come unless you have that alignment. I found in my early years of coaching tremendous appreciation and even relief on the part of my clients to have that part of their lives acknowledged and lifted up as they continued whatever journey they were either asked to be on as a coachee or a coaching client, as well as whatever they initiated personally.
Great, excellent, thank you. So let's hear from Adam. What have you seen coaching help with spiritual development?
You know, so in this idea of spiritual development, when it's a little more intentional and structured, I call it spiritual formation. We have things where we're asking people really to examine who they are, and as Jamie said, bring that into coherence with how they live, how they exist. And what I have found is that the techniques of coaching are really a beautiful complement to things that are asked in kind of the traditional comments and questions of spiritual direction. We'll get more into those definitions a little bit later, I think. But the complement that I really appreciate is having a structure that says, what is this? What do you believe? How does this work for you internally? And then to say, so what does that mean for how you live? How do you bring that out? How do you experience it? How do other people experience that knowledge that you have internally? How are they seeing it in you? Can they acknowledge that? Are they seeing what you think you're putting out? And in spiritual direction, it's so often a one-on-one conversation, sometimes a group thing, but it's not usually looking at the person and saying, okay, so let's talk to some of the other people who know you. Let's talk to some of the rest of your world. Let's have you go back and ask them some questions. There's not a lot of that experience of, so is what you think you're doing really what you're doing? And so I think that the techniques of coaching that help people examine how the inner self shows up beyond just the inner self is really essential to a kind of spiritual development that we don't often get to in church life or even in spiritual direction as a whole. Not even in spiritual retreats, other things, workshops that I've led. So often it says, who are you and what is your intent? How does that feel? But there's so little of that outer reflection that coaching encourages and allows for. And so I think that's, for me, the most essential piece that's different from everything else I've done.
It's an interesting point of the coaching can bring in feedback, right? And there's all these great tools for that, and how you can get more self-awareness through that external approach of how your behavior is showing up and with others. So interesting point. Thank you. Let's hear from Suzanne. What's been your experience?
So I think for me, the most powerful thing about coaching is the questions. And those questions often bypass and confuse, if you will, in a good way, thought patterns and beliefs that are held so dear. I think of how Christ constantly asked questions, and if depending on how you read it, almost digging at the Pharisees or those that had the spirituality all figured out, but was really calling for a deeper internal look. So for me, I've watched coaching bring people from the outside in, so that they can go outside again. My personal research was on the lived experience of being recognized, which fits both in the coaching world and in the spirituality world, in that when we truly recognize that essence, that being, of one another, and there's some mutual recognition, a whole new world opens up. And that world I would label spiritual.
Wonderful, thank you. Some exciting things that can happen in coaching, and you one of the things you mentioned is, no one's written a book yet on Jesus as coach, but I think it's in the works, right? I mean, it would be an interesting study, right? How many ICF core competencies showed up in his ministry?
That would be great mapping. A great mapping.
Wonderful. All right, our third question is, what do you see as the primary role of a coach versus a pastor or spiritual director? And how can they be used together effectively? So I think all of you are in both of these roles. So I'd love to hear how you essentially marry coaching and pastoral work or spiritual direction. So let's mix this up a little bit and start with Dr. Suzanne first.
Yeah. They are, for me, almost one and the same. I think in the spiritual pastoral work, when you think traditionally, it's about protection, it's about guiding, it's about leading, it's about being there. So oftentimes in that role, perhaps one is looking to you for more answers, where in coaching, you're feeding back because the answers are there. I personally believe in good spiritual leading. There also is that pushing back and really encouraging the individual to listen, to hear, to pull out. So they work well together, and it is the practice of questions that for me is the intersection. And just in my brief research, there's about 300 questions that Jesus asks that are recorded in the Bible. So I look forward to reading the book as Jesus as Coach.
Absolutely. So let's hear from Dr. Adam.
Sure. So yeah, I serve as the senior minister of a congregation that's about 350 people right now, and spiritual director in private practice for, I think I have 8 clients at the moment. I don't go much beyond that because it's too much with a full-time church practice, and then also do this formation piece. And there are, the Venn diagram of those is, nicely overlapping with a kind of a central spot where they all meet up together. And I do see different aspects that I bring to each one of these. Spiritual direction, the kind of core questions that are often asked are, how is it with your soul? How is your relationship with God, or the divine as you understand it? What are your spiritual practices, and how do they lead you into deeper understanding of self and the divine? When I'm working as a minister, I often think of the preaching relationship as spiritual direction for the congregation, right? I'm bringing those questions into that whole conversation all the time. And also am saying, what does it take for this corporate body of faith to be healthy? And so some of that has to do with how is it with your soul, and some of it has to do with, are you treating each other well? And do we have the right processes in place for people to participate, to engage, to meet one another? That formation piece, that piece that actually ends up really being informed by, among other things, the techniques of coaching, has a lot to do with saying to people, so how do you put this into practice? Are we making real what we think we're doing? And how are we doing that with one another? And so all of those are necessary, I think. I don't do, I don't do individual spiritual direction with members of my congregation for more than a few sessions. If they need more than that, I send them off to somebody else. Much the same way, I don't do deep coaching and formation work with individual members of my congregation. If they need that, send them to somebody else so that I can preserve my role in their lives. But I am the coach for the congregation. I'm constantly saying to the board, take a look. get some feedback. What's actually happening here? Are we doing what we think we're doing? And is what we're doing in alignment with the covenant that we have within the congregation? Is it in alignment with our beliefs and our values? So I think all three of these have a slightly different focus, but all three of them can work so beautifully together to build health for individuals and actually for whole congregations. I am not yet in a position where I'm asking those questions in my denomination, but I can see times and places where having somebody look at the denomination and say, so what's the spiritual heart? What is the practice? How does it show up? How are we living it? What does that mean? And then how do we do administration as ministry? How do we look at our ability to run the institutions of our faith in a way that is truly faithful and furthers the goals of what we're trying to do? And in all those cases, I think the questions and actions and stance of coaching allows for us to make the questions that the other two, the pastor and the spiritual director, ask, really alive, really present, and able to be tested, frankly, to make sure that what's going on is really what we think.
So I think you're bringing up a really interesting point that coaching and ministry and pastoral work is not just one-on-one. You know, it can be group and it can be organizational coaching, which is certainly what Fielding emphasizes is all of those. Is coaching in multiple different levels of organization, which certainly churches are organizations. All right. Absolutely. Well, Jamie, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Well, Adam and Suzanne held it so well, but I will say that in my tradition as a Quaker, queries are a natural part of how our faith community actually functions. That's a almost 400-year-old tradition. And so asking powerful questions was normal. Doing it in a form of personal and corporate accountability is normal. And so it's just one of my delights about being able to combine all these roles in my particular tradition. And I think there are denominational differences that are interesting and nuanced. And then there's also, Suzanne and I were talking at the very start of the call, that we're all heading for a 21st century fourth wave. Like there's a massive sea change happening across the spectrum of all faiths in an interfaith context. So what I've been finding delightful is the opportunity to allow what we call spiritual nurture to be that safe and sacred space where powerful questions can be posed, which are normal in our tradition, and that allow people to take that inward journey in both the corporate life of the meeting, the Quaker meeting, as well as their personal lives and their workplace. So what my particular congregation finds delightful is that they actually know they can come to me for coaching when they're having a vocational challenge and they're doing some life transition. It's perfectly appropriate in my role to offer that coaching to them as they make their life's journey. So they're delighted because they actually haven't had a pastor who has the coaching skills and the roadmap to do that. Now, I've also gained skills by working with David Drake's narrative coaching. And so being able to do it from that context of what is our story, because part of congregational life is all about those stories, as Suzanne said. That journey allows people to map their own story in a powerful way, along with the thresholds, the kinds of changes that they're making as they move from their current state, where they are today, to what they're searching for, to what they want to shift into and how to sustain it. The last piece, what I wanted to mention too, is that I have the delight of being faculty in my seminary, Earlham School of Religion, because we have an entrepreneurial ministry certificate. And so part of my role is to support people who have a heart for ministry, but don't want to be a pastor or a chaplain, but want to actually launch a new business. And so we're synthesizing the spiritual formation journey that Adam's talking about with the very deliberate business canvas planning and the development of the skills to become an entrepreneur. And Wonderful. So I serve as coach to those ministers. And again, in the Quaker tradition, you're a minister, everybody's got gifts and leadings we nurture. And its expression in their actual vocational life and in their employment.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. So some of you may have already answered this next question partially, but I'm going to ask it again just to see what else we might discover. And it's, what are the best ways that pastors and clergy can leverage coaching in their work? So let's hear from Adam first this time.
Sure. I think for me, it has to do with kind of the ways in which this works well, has to do with whether I'm working with individuals or groups. So in my ministry, what I've found is that the techniques of coaching, kind of in a long-term process, are what I bring to my work with the board of the church, the committees of the church, the various structures of the institution that are constantly trying to encourage self-awareness, reflection, improved praxis, right? Praxis being practice plus reflection. So I definitely bring the kind of mentality of coaching and powerful questions, deep reflection, not having to answer everything right in the moment, not looking at everything as an urgency, but instead as an opportunity for depth and learning, and to take the time to make the right choices, not the reactive ones. And that lets me do that work in the long term with the institution. When I do the kind of formation work, which for me is really where coaching and spiritual direction marry, when I'm doing that with individuals, then I do that very much, whether it is within a class or saying to somebody, yes, I will work with you for a month if we're meeting every week, or for 6 months if we're meeting once a month. But then the other piece that's so powerful is actually being able to refer people to coaches when they need a specific kind of encouragement and a specific kind of guidance that if I were to offer it would at some level diminish my ability to be their pastor, or also create what might to others appear to be too special a relationship with one person in the congregation, and make for an unhealthy social dynamic within the congregation. But being able to do that work with people and then say, now would be a great time for you to get another perspective, another person who can ask you these questions and help you consider these opportunities. So leveraging coaching for me with individuals is most often and most skillfully done, I think, in the task of referral. Having a series of people that I say, this person's really good at helping people understand this aspect of their lives, and this person has these sorts of characteristics that will work for people in a crisis around addiction, for example. Being able to refer folks to the right people means that the skills of coaching can occur not just because I might have some of those skills and some of those knowledges, but because I know how to put people in the right place with the right person, or with potential other people, depending on who they choose.
So you bring up an interesting point about ethics in this space, and I know managers of all kinds, leaders of all kinds have to deal with, can I coach my direct reports? And in some ways, not directly, but, in some ways a senior pastor of a church, practitioners have a different relationship than what you might. So that brings up some interesting points, and you use the referral strategy if it gets too deep. So I'd love to hear others' perspective on that too as we answer this question. Are there ethical, things to consider? Which I think this was an interesting one that Dr. Adam brings up. So I'm gonna go next to Jamie again, and again, what is the best ways pastors and clergy can leverage coaching in their work? And let's add in that extra twist of, are there any ethical issues you might want to be aware of?
Yeah, I'll start with that part, Terry, because Adam brings up the point that's part of the standard of pastoral care, which is it's short term. And you don't presume to be able to deliver the therapeutic relationship. So for instance, I have a master's in counseling psychology. I've been a therapist. In this particular role, and as a coach, I refer away. and make sure that I understand the bench of talent in my community for the right fit, for the right referral at the right time.
Yep.
I think that's a critical issue, and it is an important one. Because coaching is short term, it's easier to see the fusion of coaching and spiritual nurture in select cases. The issue is when it becomes one that's a much more complex mental or social concern that has to actually have long-term support. I also wanted to talk about flip the question around a little bit and talk about where there are tensions and contradictions between the role of pastor or spiritual nurturer and coaching. So example being, as I was in my own discernment for this role, I was asked repeatedly, what is my vision for this congregation as their leader? Mm-hmm. Right? And part of that discernment between myself and this community was to make it clear that that's not a role that I see playing. It's not actually a role in our tradition that the person called pastor would do. Mm-hmm. It's a complete contradiction. And so that took a while for a community that hadn't experienced that to actually settle back into the understanding that we're in this journey together and we share that expertise. Mm-hmm. The other occupational hazard is telling. Telling is a thing. And part of that's learning to preach, and part of that, as Suzanne pointed out, being able to unpack sacred text, and that you have the secret knowledge or the decoder ring, and so you're the one to tell people what it means. And of course, that's anymore not seen as best practice in the pastoral or spiritual formation space, because meaning making has to happen individually and then in the group conscience. But it is an occupational hazard that I find as I begin to meet pastors who are from different traditions and also at a different point in their career.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I'm curious how you have managed that balance between folks basically wanting to bring down the tablets to have you do that versus asking the questions.
Right. Well, and what Adam pointed out too is that thing about being the preacher. So what is the role of the preacher? Of course, we don't call it preaching in our tradition. We called it the prepared message. And we have another understanding that since we have that of God within all of us, and each of us equally have access to God's wisdom in the moment, through continuing revelation, my prepared message may actually be shifting because your own spiritual journey is impacting me in the moment. And it's up to me at an intuitive level to experience that instruction, basically, from the divine. So in our space, in the preaching space is much shorter in duration, and there's a period of time equal to the amount of time of prepared message for silent contemplative worship, and for all to be welcome to speak into that space. That has actually required some spiritual nurture because a group had become accustomed to not doing that and had to actually be supported in learning how to allow their own inner wisdom to show up, which is very much what happens in the coaching space.
Right. Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that comparison. So, Dr. Suzanne, I'd love to hear your perspective on.
Yeah, I'm actually going to flip the script a little bit as well, because I think recently there has been some foot traffic, if you will, of known and unknown Christian leaders that are stepping back and deconstructing their beliefs because of burnout, because of stress. So coaching, and I think I mentioned this earlier, something that ICF supports is, coaching clergy, that the leaders themselves take advantage and utilize coaches in supporting their own professional spiritual development. I think it's so important. The ethical issues of that line between spiritual development, psychotic break, mental illness, general coaching life situations. There are some really clear lines. You also mentioned, Adam, what I would consider managerial coaching. And I also have a certificate from Georgia in managerial coaching, which is very different when they're your employees or your congregants, the relationships. For me, one of the best ways that clergy can leverage coaching is by example, by engaging the support at the level that they need it before they get to the burnout stage, which impacts not only themselves, their health, but their congregation as a whole, or their group, or their whatever gathering name is given.
Great. Well, thank you. So I have one. Oh, go ahead. Yes, Adam.
I thought, Jamie, you brought up something really interesting, which is that the coaching is meant to be short-term, right? It's not a long-term work, just like pastoral care is meant to be, to kind of get somebody through to the point where you can figure out then what do you need next. Yeah. And institutionally, the coaching relationship, in my experience, is short-term in that my board members don't all stay the same for years and years and years on end. But one of the differences is that I have spiritual directees that I've been speaking to for, I want to say, almost 15 years now. So I have individuals that I have been in that kind of relationship with. And that is one of the kind of core differences, I think, that is worth lifting up about what coaching is and does, versus what pastoring is and does, and spiritual direction. In the pastoring space, I have people that I will be with for as long as I'm at a church. My longest pastorate now has been 8 years, almost 8 years. But I have people that I've been talking to individually as a spiritual director, almost twice that. And I'm going to be dealing with the coaching sorts of things and encouraging people to find that. And that may take 6 months. It may be 4 weeks, depending on what they're working on. So I think the recognition of the time differences in those relationships is also an important thing to just hold in mind when you're thinking about all of these ways of being and how they work together.
And I want to lift up, Adam, as well, that your point about formation is a long-term journey. It's not a short-term journey.
Yep. And
it's one that coaching skills can be infused into quite successfully, but it itself is unique.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Great. Excellent. Well, one last prepared question. That's what advice do you have for other pastors and clergy wanting to develop professional coaching skills? And let's start with Jamie.
I'll start. I actually have some coaching clients that are other Quaker pastors who are wanting to now develop their coaching skills and take a coaching course and get certified so that they are able to move forward in a new expression of their ministry in that space. And their image is to actually bring coaching to other clergy and other congregations to support them on the journey. Because as you know, there's so many, as Suzanne said, there's so many ways you can call a group that's gathered together for a spiritual purpose. And so to be able to offer that support to them is one of the edges that I'm seeing growing, a growing edge for the work. And a lot of excitement, and a lot of money, frankly, too. Lilly Foundation has actually got a very specific initiative to nurture that. And so they are very interested in innovations in that space.
You mean they're funding this work? That's great.
Yes.
Good to know. Let's hear from Dr. Suzanne.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say one of the best ways would be Fielding's EBC program. I'll take your thunder away, Terry. But just seriously, what the evidence-based coaching program at Fielding does is allow one both the the theory as well as the practice in multiple areas as opposed to just one psychological foundation. Because when we get into working with real people, they're not all the same. So having one approach is kind of like putting a square peg in a round hole. The fielding evidence-based program for me, I thought was, and I've have other learnings as well, but for me it was the most well-rounded and has an appreciation for the soul that extends beyond just the mental emotional, but also includes the spiritual.
Great, thank you very much. Let's hear from Dr. Adam. What have you found, and what advice might you have for other pastors?
So I think, Suzanne, you mentioned something really important, which is that variety of different angles and techniques and ways of thinking about things. Because there are so many different ways that one can approach coaching, and so many different perspectives and so many different people who need different ways to be interacted with. I think for me, I would say to people, take the time and discernment before you begin to figure out what you want to do in coaching. If you find a general coaching class that gives you a sense of basic techniques and understandings, fantastic. But at some level, what you want to know is, what kind of coach do I want to be? And that might take a few different classes. It might take reading some different things. It might take talking to different kinds of coaches to see what it is that they do. But I think that it's going to be important for someone to figure out, am I the sort of person who wants to coach people around the business aspect of ministry, the administration part, and understanding how that is ministry and how we do it efficiently? Do I want to be the kind of coach that helps other clergy become more effective or more congruent in certain aspects of their ministry? Do I want to be the kind of coach who says to people, in your life, how does your spirituality show up, and how does that show through in every way? There are lots and lots of different ways you could be a coach in the realm of spiritual and religious being.
Yeah.
And I think to spend the time in discernment, whether you do that with a pastor or another coach or a spiritual director, whatever it is that you find, to spend time asking those questions and really allowing yourself to unearth what it is that your calling is in that work, so that you can make wise choices about where you're going to land. It is too easy to become the perpetual student and to spend endless hours and endless amounts of money trying on all sorts of different things, and then never really knowing what it is that you're going for because you haven't thought about it deeply enough. You're just excited by everything you see. There's nothing wrong with that enthusiasm. But if you want to bring coaching into your ministry or into ministry in some fashion, it will be invaluable to understand why you want to do that and what that calling, what that is that's drawing you forward into that work.
It sounds like a great opportunity to work with a coach. To figure that out. Excellent. So we do have already a question from the audience. So I'm going to switch gears, and Lisa, would you like to come online and ask your question and share your comment?
Sure. Thank you all for your insights that I deeply appreciate on coaching the whole person. I had a quick question referring to Adam's comment on maintaining positive relationships and knowing when to refer an individual externally. For all of you, how do you know when is the best time to refer an individual to additional resources towards owning their own personal process and transformation? I know you might have touched on that a little bit, but to expand on that, thank you.
I'm happy to jump in since I was the person who opened the box in the first place. For me, there are a number of things that help me understand when it's best to refer. One is when I know that the need goes beyond my capacity, my understanding, or my skill set. Or when it touches on something that I feel personally uncomfortable with and therefore not capable of really entering into that conversation fully with somebody. So when I know that I have a limitation of one sort or another, I take that as an opportunity to refer them to someone who can be more more useful, more helpful. The other is when I sense that somebody has become reliant on me in a way that they're asking my advice, not valuing my ability to question what they're doing, but instead they want me to tell them how to do it. Mm-hmm. That is a moment in which I know that referral is a good response. I also have to know whether I'm working as a formator or as a spiritual director or as a pastor. Because if I'm working with someone as a formator, there are times when I will tell them how to do it. That's actually my job. That is part of what I am meant to do in terms of helping seminarians become ministers. I need to give them some of that guidance. But there are definitely times when I see somebody who will say, well, you always tell me what to do in the right way, or I always get such good insight from you. How would you handle this? If my job with them is to be a spiritual director or to be drawing out the best in them in a coaching format, whenever I hear those sorts of questions or comments, I know that it's time for them to work with somebody else because they're too reliant on me and not reliant enough on themselves.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The third thing is when I sense or there's evidence of a need for a different type of referral, i.e. a mental health referral, a substance referral, something that's beyond the scope of minister or coach. They need a therapist. They need an addiction counselor, something like that. Those referrals are made in gentle, loving kindness.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts, Jamie?
They said it all.
Great.
The only thing I would add is, you're in the soup when the level of complexity is profound.
Absolutely. So Jamie, we have a question from Jordan. Jordan, would you like to come online and ask your question? Jordan, you are unmuted.
Okay, thanks. Someone mentioned decoding sacred texts as part of the work you do, and I'm curious how the skills and insights that you need to decode sacred texts has helped prepare you for decoding an individual's spiritual development that you unveil during coaching.
A fantastic question, Jordan. And easy for me to answer specifically because I think Adam will have an entirely different perspective and a very grounded one. We have a way in our tradition of engaging with a sacred text with all trust that any authority, any written commentary stays out of the room. And each individual's reading of the text and their own engagement with it is enough. That their own journey in engaging with the material will allow them to have insights that all kinds of reading may not. And so it's interesting because there are some things in sacred text, for instance, if something was written in Hebrew and we actually don't know what that word was or meant, that changes the meaning of the thing if you read it for its value in the time it was written. But each individual's moment of engaging with the words themselves is a moment of their own relationship with the sacred.
Any other thoughts on this question?
I would just add that we ourselves are living human documents. We are sacred text. So for me, in my academic journey, I fell in love with Paul Ricoeur and his style of hermeneutics, which really goes back and looks at it from different levels. That same technique, that same practice can be used on us as living human documents. So that sacred decoding is actually the same practice, different documents.
Yeah, and just for those who aren't familiar, hermeneutics is the interpretation of text. And certainly one of the research methods that we teach at Fielding in the doctoral program in a significant way. So it's important to be able to interpret in so many ways. Adam, any other additional thoughts on this?
Yeah, so in my tradition, as a Unitarian Universalist, we draw not just on one sacred text, but on many. And so the Hebrew scriptures, the Greek scriptures are important, but we also will go back to the sutras. We will go back to the Bhagavad Gita. We will go back to, all these ancient texts. We also see contemporary texts as potentially sacred. And so the learnings of science, we often use poetry. If you're familiar at all with Unitarian Universalism, we have a particular love for Mary Oliver and Wendell Berry. I have a deep adoration for Alison Luterman and Jane Hirschfeld. So there are many things that for us become sacred text, including our own experience. And the practice of exegesis, drawing meaning from within the text for the self or for the community, a way to preach from that, is actually, I think, very much what happens in spiritual direction, formation, and coaching, is asking, as Suzanne said, those sorts of questions that if you wanted to understand what a text said or meant, you would come back and ask the same thing of yourself. So talking about narrative coaching and narrative therapy, what is my story? How do I tell my story? What languages do I use? Do I use materialistic languages? Do I use poetic languages? Do I use theological languages?
Wonderful.
Understanding, and I would say having a literacy with theology. So understanding different forms of theology is actually a really essential piece to this too. So if somebody comes to me and speaks from a prosperity gospel mindset, that's going to be very different from somebody who understands the world in a process theology format or a relational and open theology format. These may be words that you're not familiar with yet, but if you start working with ministers and pastors and people who deal with the realms of theology, having some of that literacy is important. And so the same questions that you ask to understand a text, to draw meaning out of it, you are going to be asking individuals to do on their own lives, with their own understandings, with their own theologies and ethics.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So we probably have time for one more question from the audience. Does anyone like to ask one more question from our panel today? Okay. If not, I would like to
Jerry, I have a question for you.
Yes, please.
So what do you see as the future of this kind of work in Fielding's programs?
So Fielding has always been multidisciplinary, including religion, theology. Hermeneutics has always been a core research method for whatever text you're reading, whether it be a scholarly text or a sacred text. And so I think in my mind, I think we are trying to bring coaching to all professions. And the very purpose of these evidence-based coaching professional series is to show how coaching can really transform the world in every single area of life, every single profession, every single industry. And I think pastoral care is a really important space. And I think that will continue to grow and expand just like it is in the world of leadership and healthcare, education, even psychology is beginning to incorporate. And there's been some muddying of the lines of psychology and coaching together, and they certainly have supported each other in significant ways. So we're going to continue to explore this space, and I'm really welcoming the spiritual direction and pastoral community into Fielding, and I think it's a great place to explore these things in a very ecumenical way, across every tradition. And I know the three of you come from kind of this perspective of, that is broad in many ways and comes from multiple traditions. And we welcome that to continue. So I'm excited about where Fielding can really influence in this spiritual development area. And it is a core part of our curriculum is looking at, like Suzanne mentioned, we look not only at the cognitive and emotional, but also the spiritual. So it is a whole person approach to coaching and multi-dimensional in all of our aspects of how we bring coaching to the world, whether it be, like Adam's mentioned, in training and helping pastors develop as leaders and to support the OD of coaching in spiritual communities, or the individual growth that shows up in one-on-one coaching. All of that is part of our agenda and helping leaders be successful in using coaching skills. So I just want to thank all of you for coming today and being a part of this panel. And how can folks continue this dialogue if they'd like to reach you later? Is that something that you're open to? I know your websites are all listed on the Fielding's website. Is that something you're available to for further conversation?
Absolutely.
Sure. Absolutely.
Great.
And Terry, I just want to throw out what I would be curious about in a future panel is the whole concept of marketplace ministry. Jamie's entrepreneurial ministry, other faith traditionists call it marketplace ministry, but I think that might be another interesting place where coaching intersects with spirituality and business.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you. Excellent. So we had one last question, and maybe we can quickly answer that one. Adaro, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. Yeah, so it sounds like each of you are working from your own ministerial traditions and within those traditions. And my background is varied, and the ministers I work with have backgrounds that are varied. We're in an independent congregation with membership that's varied because we're from an LGBTQ community, and many people are there because they weren't accepted elsewhere. So then I wonder about coaching. Do you see coaching approaches for spiritual ministries and ministers reaching across two groups like ours?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no doubt.
So, yeah, as a Unitarian Universalist, I have people who have an enormous variety of theological perspectives as well as faith backgrounds. So we have people who are atheist and agnostic. We have people who are Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, pagan, etc. And lots of queer people in our congregations too. And my experience around coaching in particular is that the openness, allowing people to bring their context and their understanding, is what will allow all of those people to find something valuable in what is offered to them. It doesn't matter what your particular perspective is if you give people space to approach it from their place. So I try to hold the widest possible perspective. I have people who come to me whose theologies I don't really agree with. I find strange or somehow not in really solid alignment. But allowing them to explore that and to use questions to help them understand what they're doing means that it doesn't really matter whether I'm talking to a Buddhist one day and a Jew another day and a Christian a third day, or if they're all of the same perspective. Making room within that relationship for their spiritual wisdom to arise and frame the conversation allows everybody to find something valuable in the work.
Great, thank you.
I would also just quickly add that it's in the LGBTQIA communities that you see the most innovation in the 21st century expression of faith, and really wonderful examples across the country, new churches being born, new locations of these churches, and the coaching skills are particularly useful because of this wide diversity that you've mentioned and that Adam's just mentioned. So being respectful of understanding where folks have come from, their stories, their gifts and abilities, and the questions they hold in their heart and what they want and need to learn is entirely possible.
Yeah, and I would just add, as a non-denominational, the opportunity for coalition building and solidarity that isn't encumbered by denominational lines is somewhat exciting and wonderful as well. It comes with different challenges and different skill sets, but definitely one that I enjoy.
Yeah, I'd just like to So first of all, thank you for all of this, and also just say that the very core of coaching is unconditional positive regard, which means that whatever the client brings, we hold that in esteem. So it's kind of a very definition of what we're trying to do here, and certainly being welcoming of people from all backgrounds is a core tenet as a coach. So. But thank you all. It's been a really exciting journey here in the last hour to really talk to you all about this really important topic. And certainly this will be an ongoing conversation, both at Fielding and hopefully in the larger world. And again, thank you for all your time. I just have a couple of quick announcements that I'd like to invite all of you to be part of our coaching community of practice. Fielding has an open system of learning, and we do invite everyone who would like to continue to participate in these webinars to join us at ccop.fielding.edu, and that stands for Coaching Community of Practice. So it's easy to find, ccop.fielding.edu. You can register so that you can stay informed and have online dialogues about these and other important issues in many, many domains of life and work. We also have these webinars twice a month. This is part of an ongoing series. Our next webinar will be on creating culture of coaching in organizations. So we'll hear from a prominent HR leader and about her journey of how she has been able to create a culture of coaching in her organization. We call it the Thought Leaders webinar series, where individuals talk about research and practice. So we invite you to join. You can also learn more about all of our events, not only on our coaching community of practice, but also on our blog. And I'm going to just quickly share the screen so you can see that and be aware of how that works. So our blog posts are simple to achieve. You just go to fielding.edu/blog and see all of the things about coaching that you can participate in for no charge or low charge. So we look forward to hopefully having you at our next event that's coming up on September 11th. So bye for now, and again, thanks to all of our esteemed panel.
Thank you.
Much.